Introduction. In a dense forest, where the air seems viscous and the sunlight only glimmers through the dense foliage, 5 friends decided to have a picnic. Little did they know that this outing would be a journey into another world, where time slows down and fear becomes physically tangible. Backstory. Each of them brought not only a basket of food to this picnic, but also their own secrets. Emily, always smiling, was hiding a heartbreak. A year ago our best friend disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Liam, the leader of the group, felt deep down that this trip did not bode well, but, as always, played the role of the brave hero. Marcus, with his eternal jokes, hid his fear of being rejected. Clara, the most silent, reached for nature, as if only among the trees could she feel safe. And Aiden was a mystery even to himself. The idea of going into the woods was Emily's. She said, "Those woods must be incredibly beautiful in autumn. And I hear there's an old hunting cabin there. It's like the perfect adventure picnic." But as soon as they stepped onto the winding path that led deep into the woods, something invisible loomed up that seemed to follow them like a shadow. Part 1. Shadows on the Trail. The group starts heading into the woods, the mood shifting from joy to anxiety, the first oddity being sounds that shouldn't be there. Am I the only one who notices how too quiet it is? Marcus asked, adjusting his rucksack. Liam turned round, his gaze tired but calm. You're just wishy-washy. This is the forest, Marcus, not some horror film. Yet even Liam couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just nature that surrounded them. The trees stood too close, their branches reaching for each other as if trying to lock their guests in their grim embrace. Do you hear that? Clara asked suddenly, stopping. Everyone froze. Somewhere ahead there was the crunch of dry twigs, but it sounded strange, not like the footsteps of a man or an animal. It sounded more like someone scrambling across the ground without getting up. Oh, it's just a deer or something, Emily said, trying to hide the tremor in her voice. No mysticism whatsoever. Liam nodded as if in agreement, but his hand gripped the lantern tighter. Part 2. The Hunting Cabin. The group finds a hut and decides to stop for a rest. The atmosphere becomes more and more ominous, the first clear threat. When the hut finally came into their sight, no one was happy. It looked like it was part of the forest. The walls were covered in moss, the roof was askew, and the windows were broken. Cozy, isn't it? Marcus grinned, though his voice didn't have its usual lightness. It's only temporary, Liam said. We'll get something to eat, and then we'll come back. It smelled rotten and damp inside, but it was better than staying out in the open with the growing feeling that they were being watched. As they lay out their food, Emily suddenly noticed a strange symbol carved into one of the beams. It was a triangle with a circle in the center, circled by many chaotic lines. Someone really missed geometry class, Marcus muttered. But Clara froze, her face white as chalk. I've seen it, she said in a whisper. On old pages in the library, when I was studying folklore. It's a sign, it's a trap. Liam grinned, but nervously. A trap for who? Her gaze darted to the door. For us. Part 3. Other voices. As night falls, the characters begin to hear voices, and then one of the friends disappears. The night takes them by surprise. Emily, looking at the fading sunset, muttered, "Why is the sun going down so fast?" Marcus tried to joke, but the laughter sounded unconvincing. They gathered around the fire, but even the fire didn't seem warm enough in this icy silence. Do you hear that? Aiden said suddenly. Everyone froze. Voices. Quiet, whispering voices, as if dozens of people were speaking at once, but their words were inaudible. It's the wind, Emily said quickly, but her voice shook. There's no wind here, Clara whispered. And then the creepiest thing happened. Marcus, who had been sitting by the fire, stood up. It's too quiet, he said, as if to someone unseen. I'll just check. He stepped beyond the light of the fire and disappeared into the darkness. Seconds turned into minutes, and then his voice came from behind the trees. Hey guys, I found something. You guys need to see this. Liam stood up, but Clara grabbed his arm. Don't go, it's not him. What the hell is this nonsense? Liam tried to break free. It's Marcus. But Marcus shouted again, and there was laughter in his voice. Only it wasn't the laughter they knew. It sounded hollow, devoid of soul. Part 4, Abyss in the Dark. Liam decides to check Marcus's voice. The others try to stop him, but the forest begins to change their perception of reality. Liam rips his arm out of Clara's grip and steps into the darkness, as if the darkness itself pulled him in. Liam, stop. It's not him. Emily shouted, but it was too late. The others stayed by the fire, listening intensely to the night sounds. Soon Marcus's voice came again. Liam. It's unbelievable. Come here, you have to see this. But the strangeness was intensifying. The voice sounded too close, as if it were coming from several places at once. Clara took hold of Emily's hand. Her palm was as cold as ice. They're playing with us, she whispered. I don't know who, but they're watching. Aiden, who had been silent until then, rose to his feet. Let's just get out of here. Leave them if we have to, but we don't have to stay. His words burned Emily. We can't just leave. It's Liam and Marcus. But while they were arguing, a scream came to them. It was short, sharp, and cutting off. It was Liam. Emily snapped out of her seat, running towards the sound, but Clara grabbed her again. Are you out of your mind? She shouted. If you go, there'll be 3 of us. They'll drag us into this one at a time. Aiden, surprisingly calm, turned away from them and stared into the woods. He muttered something to himself, but Clara heard him. It's been in us for a long time. What did you say? She asked sharply. But Aiden said nothing. Part 5, Labyrinth of Shadows. Emily and Clara realize that their minds are beginning to muddle and Aiden is behaving more and more strangely. They find notes in the cabin revealing hints that something ancient is behind the forest. We need to go back to the cabin, Clara said firmly. Emily, breathing hard, looked around. The darkness grew thicker, and every rustle rang in her ears like thunder. Aiden. She shouted, but he just waved his hand and kept his gaze on the trees. There's nothing else here, he said. Clara dragged her behind him. Leave him. He is already lost. When they returned to the cabin, its interior had changed. The floorboards were broken, as if someone had scattered them, and the symbol on the wall now glowed with a dim violet light. It's impossible, Emily whispered. It's just not possible. There were pieces of paper on the table. On them was written in a strange language, but between the lines were flickering words in English: sacrifice, cycle, don't tear. Clara, gritting her teeth, took one of the sheets. It was a warning. They've done it more than once. Who? Emily asked. Clara didn't answer right away. Her voice was quiet, like the rustling of leaves. The forest. It doesn't just observe. It creates. Emily was shaking with fear, but she squirmed. Creates what? Stories, Clara said. Us. We're just part of another cycle. Part 6, who are we now? The forest reveals to the heroes their weaknesses, and they begin to lose touch with reality. Aiden disappears, leaving behind a strange trail leading deep into the thicket. When they run outside again, Aiden is gone. There were deep furrows in the ground, as if he had been dragged by force. We should have left, Emily whispered, repeating it like a mantra. He wouldn't have left, Clara replied sharply. Neither would Liam. But then their argument was interrupted by quiet laughter. It came from all directions, as if the forest were laughing at them. Emily suddenly felt the ground beneath her feet begin to shake. What is that? Clara listened, and her face contorted with horror. They're waking up. Emily looked at her, not understanding. Who's they? Clara didn't answer. Instead, She began to back away slowly, her eyes widening. We weren't supposed to come here. This is their world. Emily wanted to scream, but at that moment something huge and shapeless appeared between the trees. It had no face, but she knew it was looking right at her. Part 7, Open Doors. Emily and Clara encounter a manifestation of the essence of the forest that plays with their minds. They begin to see memories that never happened and wonder which one of them is real. Emily froze, unable to take her eyes off the shapeless shadow looming between the trees. It seemed both distant and frighteningly close. It sees us, she whispered. It knows who we are. Clara stumbled backward against the wall of the cabin and felt a strange warmth beneath her hand. Turning around, she saw that the symbols on the beams had begun to move, as if drawn by an invisible hand. Don't look there, Clara shouted. It's a trap, you know? It's trying to make you. But it was too late. Emily stared, her gaze growing more and more detached. I see, she said in a muffled voice. They're waiting. They were always waiting. Clara grabbed her by the shoulders and shook her. Stop it. Don't let them take you. Emily struggled to snap out of her daze and inhaled sharply, as if she'd come back from a deep sleep. Seemed so real, she whispered, holding her head. They were showing me things. Events that didn't happen, but I could feel them. Clara turned away, clenching her fists. They break us from the inside out. They're looking for weakness. But before Emily could answer, Aiden's voice came from the darkness. Emily, Clara, I found a way out. He stood a few meters away from them, but something about his figure was off. Too straight, too unnatural. It's not him, Clara whispered. Can you see it? It's a projection of them. What if he is real after all? Emily objected, her voice echoing in a broken echo. We can't leave him. Aiden stepped forward, his eyes glowing with an unnatural amber light. You have to come with me, he said, his voice sounding like two voices speaking at once. There's no more time. Part 8, in the mirror. Emily decides to go after Aiden, but Clara tries to stop her. The forest reveals more and more of their own weaknesses, playing on fears and memories. We're not going, Clara says firmly, blocking Emily's path. It's a trap. Look at him. It's not human. But Emily hesitated. She saw something familiar in the amber eyes. Something comforting. What if this is our only chance? She whispered. Maybe he knows a way out. Clara turned sharply and pointed toward the forest. Look around you. This forest is an illusion. Everything they show is a lie. Aiden held out his hand, and his voice became quieter, but that made it even more frightening. Emily, you're one of us. You always have been. Don't you see that? And then the forest changed. The trees around them began to slowly fade away, like candles melting under the heat of a flame. Mirrors took their place. Each one reflected Emily and Clara, but the images were distorted, grotesque. Emily approached one of the mirrors and saw herself in it, but her eyes were empty, like a marionette's. She shrieked and stepped back. They're playing with us, Clara said, her voice trembling but with determination. But that means they're afraid of us. Emily looked at her in disbelief. Afraid? We're just people. What do we have that they're afraid of? Clara looked around the cabin and the forest around her. If they're trying so hard to break us, then there must be something in us they can't control. Part 9, The Key from Within. Clara and Emily try to use the symbols on the walls of the cabin to break the forest's connection to their minds. But the forest responds by showing its true nature. Clara took one of the symbol sheets and began scratching something on the floor of the cabin with a sharp stone. I've read about this, she said, still working. The symbols are keys. They can lock and unlock doors. What doors? Emily asked, trembling. Clara looked up at her. The doors to their world. But as soon as she finished the final touch, the air around them thickened. The symbols on the walls of the hut flashed brightly, and a low roar came from the forest, shaking the earth. "They're angry," Clara whispered. "That means we're on the right track." Suddenly the doors of the hut flew open, and a gust of wind blew in, filled with whispers. The voices grew louder, and among them Emily heard a familiar intonation, the voice of her vanished friend. "Emily, save us." She rushed for the door, but Clara stood in her way. "It's a trick. I'm trying to lure you in." But Emily didn't care anymore. Her mind was filling with memories and images, real or not. She pushed Clara away and stepped over the threshold. Part 10. Threshold Beyond the Fringe. Emily crosses the line between realities, confronting the true nature of the forest and her place in it. Clara tries to bring her back, but the choice has already been made. The finale brings an abrupt and stunning twist. Stepping beyond the threshold, Emily finds herself in a void. The sound of her breathing rumbled in the bottomless space. The darkness was different here, thick, as if it were something to be molded out of. And ahead, barely visible, a dim glow flickered. Marcus's voice came again, going now. "Emily, you're close. You've almost found us." She moved forward, treading on an invisible surface. Every movement she made had a strange tingling sensation in her body, as if the space around her was trying to enter her. "It's an illusion," Clara's voice came from behind her. She was standing in the doorway, but her face was shadowed. "Emily, don't do this." "I need to know the truth," Emily replied without turning around. "If it really is Marcus and Liam, I can't leave them." Clara took a step after her, but stopped immediately, clutching her head. "You don't understand. It's not the forest. It's them. They're using the forest to lure us out." "Who are they?" Emily whispered, moving closer to the light. But she didn't hear Clara's answer. The whispering in her head grew louder and louder, overpowering everything else. And then she reached the light. In front of her was a round altar carved from a strange gray stone. On its surface flickered symbols identical to those in the hut, but here they moved as if alive. And in the center of the altar, surrounded by darkness, stood Marcus. His face was haggard and his eyes were empty. "You came," he said, and his voice broke the silence like thunder. "You're the only one who could make it. Marcus?" Emily stepped closer. "What happened to you?" He raised his hand, pointing to the symbols on the altar. "It's all part of the cycle. They feed on our pain, our fear. They are us." Her mind flickered at his words. She didn't understand. "What do you mean?" "We're all here," he continued. "The forest is just a mirror. We are the source of their power. And to break the cycle, we have to make a choice." At that moment, the darkness around them began to thicken. The voices intensified, calling to her, whispering her name, offering answers and peace. "What choice?" She screamed, trying to shout over the whispers. "Stay here or replace me," Marcus said, and there was no emotion in his voice. Clara ran up to Emily, screaming, but her voice was barely audible. "Don't listen to him. If you stay, they'll take you. You will lose yourself." "But if I leave," Emily whispered, "what will happen to him?" Marcus looked at her, his eyes still empty. "It doesn't matter. None of us are real anymore." Finale, sharp strike. Emily closed her eyes. Her breathing quickened, her thoughts wavering between fear and guilt. She took a step forward, touching the altar with her hands. "I can't leave him," she whispered. But at that moment, Clara grabbed her arm, yanking her backward. Emily lost her balance and fell to her knees. "Stop it!" Clara shouted. "You don't understand. It's all a lie." Marcus disappeared as soon as she toppled off the altar, and instead, a burst of bright light erupted from the altar. The space around them shattered like a mirror shattering into 1,000 shards. And Emily woke up. She was lying on the damp ground, the shadows of the trees still moving around her, but the cabin was gone. Instead, she saw Clara standing over her with an ashy face. "Is it over?" Emily whispered. Clara, breathing heavily, nodded. "Perhaps it is. But the forest, it would always find a way back." And then Emily looked down and noticed the symbol carved on her wrist, as if it had always been there. Philosophical conclusions. The story of the forest is not just a story about mystical forces or ancient curses. It is a metaphor for man's inner struggle to find the truth even when it is hidden behind a veil of lies and illusions. The forest became a mirror reflecting the fears, weaknesses, and the darkest corners of the characters' minds. It was not just a physical place, but an embodiment of the inner conflicts that proliferate if not understood and accepted. Emily and Clara represented two different approaches to fear. One sought to unravel and fix, the other to escape and protect. Their encounter with the forest is a clash of choices that confronts each of us in one form or another. What do we choose when faced with the unknown? Fight or flight? Justification or acceptance? The symbols, shadows, and voices were not all just visual and sound elements. They represented intrusive thoughts, regrets, and false hopes. It was as if the forest was asking, what if you're your own worst enemy? After all, the real mystical power of this place lay not in the spirits, but in the way it manipulated human desires and weaknesses. The finale, where Emily and Clara escape the forest, is not so much a victory as a lesson. By choosing each other over illusions, they proved that the only way to survive in the chaos of fear is to rely on connection with others, trust, and support. However, the symbol left on Emily's wrist emphasizes that experience never goes away without a trace. We always carry the scars of the past with us, and it is up to us whether they become a reminder of strength or a source of new fear. The forest in this story is not only an external threat, but also an allegory of how the past, regrets, and unresolved issues can trap us in an endless cycle of pain. Every time we don't accept ourselves or our mistakes, we add another symbol to the walls of our minds, turning it into a shack where our fears whisper from the darkness. But there is also hope. The forest has shown that even the darkest forces fear the human will and ability to choose. That the heroines were able to emerge from it speaks to the power of reason, that despite manipulation and fear, we remain masters of our destiny. The forest will return, but the choice will always remain ours. After all, in the end, the worst monster is our own shadow, and the path to the light begins with facing it.